Hello friends, this is Miss Ella and I'm happy you are here again for a new lesson of harmony at home. I bet you were singing our Argentinian song to your family this week. It's a beautiful song that stays in our heads and our hearts, right? If you didn't sing it to your family, you can still do it this week. I'm sure they will be happy to hear you singing in Spanish. For today's lesson, we are going to travel in time again. This time to the period that comes just after the Baroque period. We are going to visit the classical period and learn about a very well-known composer who wrote music at that time. Our friend Ted, who joined us for our lesson on the Baroque period, will also be with us for a short time today to teach us what life was like during the classical period. We will also do a fun exercise with a piece that was written 250 years ago. But first, let's warm up with our weekly game. Today we will add 2 more notes to our game. And since we already learned 5 notes, these are the last 2 notes we need to complete the 7 steps we have talked about in our past lessons. Do you remember the names of the notes we already know? Let's review them together. Do, re, mi, fa, and so. We will add today the notes la and ti. All you need to do is repeat after me. But don't forget to pay attention to the names of the notes, their pitch, and their rhythm. Ready? Do, re, mi, fa, do, re, mi, fa, re, mi, fa, so, re, mi, fa, so, la, ti, la, ti, la, so, fa, mi, re, so, fa, mi, re, do, mi, so, do, mi, so, re, fa, la, re, fa, la, ti, la, so, fa, mi, ti, la, so, fa, mi, re, do, do, re, mi, fa, so, do, re, mi, fa, so, la, fa, re, so, mi, do, re, mi, do, re, mi, do. Very good! Did you notice we can already sing real melodies by using those notes? Isn't that great? A few lessons ago, you didn't know the names of the different notes, and now you can even sing them. I'm really proud of you. Do you know which note comes after T? Well, it starts all over again. A double bass or a cello would play the notes that are on the lower steps, while a violin would play the notes that are on the higher steps. Just one last thing. In the language of music, the notes are not written on steps. They are written on lines. We will learn that too very soon. Today we're traveling back in time to the classical period. That's the period that came just after the Baroque period. You will see that every period we learn about is different from the one before, but also related to it, sort of like a response or a reaction to the previous period. Do you remember we talked about the Baroque period and the composers who wrote mostly for the church and for nobility? That music was formal, full of ornaments, and it was intended for a serious purpose. Well, during the classical period, music became a source of entertainment that could be enjoyed by more people, not only the nobility. And the keyword for this music was simplicity. Let's listen to an example of music from the classical period. You will hear a simple melody that has no ornaments with a simple accompaniment. Did you enjoy this beautiful and simple melody? This piece was written by one of the most important composers of all time. His name was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and I will be sharing his story with you today. Mozart was born about 250 years ago in Austria, a country in Europe. His father, Leopold Mozart, was a very well-known composer and a violin player, and music was a very important part of their home while the young Mozart was growing up. In fact, when he was just 3 years old, Wolfgang began to play the piano, and by the age of 4, he was already able to play one of his father's compositions for violin, even though no one had taught him to play the instrument. This is when his father realized that Wolfgang was a genius, and from that moment on, he dedicated himself to the musical education of Wolfgang and his sister. He taught both of them how to play the piano and the violin, and when he noticed that Wolfgang was already writing his very own pieces, he began teaching him the art of composing. By the age of 6, when most of us are still learning to read our first words, Wolfgang had composed this piece for keyboard, the first of over 600 pieces he would write during his life. It's hard to imagine a 6-year-old child composing this piece, isn't it? The Mozart's home was a merry place, and the Mozart family was a warm and caring family. Wolfgang loved singing and playing games with his sister and his friends, but he always took music very seriously, and his father had made a plan to develop his son's talent. Leopold Mozart decided that in order to share his son's talent with the world, he would have to move his family from their home city of Salzburg to the city of Vienna, the capital and largest city in Austria, which was at that moment one of the most important cultural centers in the world. At that time, there were no cars or trains or airplanes. People traveled in carriages pulled by horses. So this trip and many others Mozart took as a little boy took many days. This trip was a great success, and the 6-year-old Mozart captivated everyone with his playing. Since the trip went so well, the family spent the next 3.5 years traveling in Europe, from Austria to Germany, from Germany to France, and from France to England. In every country, both Wolfgang and his sister played in front of kings, queens, and other noble people, and in every place they stayed for a few months. In England, the Mozart family stayed for over a year, and young Wolfgang even met one of Bach's children, who also became his teacher. When Mozart was just 9 years old, while the family was living in England, he composed more than 40 pieces, including his first symphony. The symphony was a new form of composition that developed in the classical period. A symphony is a musical composition for an orchestra, normally in 3 or 4 movements. You remember what movements are, right? They are the parts of a piece of music that are like chapters in a book. In this symphony, there are 3 movements. Let's take a closer look at the first movement of the first symphony composed by Mozart at the age of 9. We will listen to the beginning and then we will do an activity. You will see that with all you have learned in the last couple of weeks, you can understand the language of music that Mozart used to compose this piece. quite impressive, don't you think? Especially for a 9-year-old. He probably got some help from his father, but it's still Wolfgang's piece, and it's quite remarkable. In the beginning of this piece, there is a musical phrase that has 2 parts. Each part has a different personality, sort of like 2 different characters in a play. Let's listen to the beginning again and try to hear those 2 contrasting characters. This first phrase will be repeated. Could you hear those 2 different characters? What is the difference between them? The first one is more energetic, more alive. Let's listen again to the first part of the phrase. The second one feels slower, peaceful. Let's listen again to the second part of the phrase. We will work today on the first part of the phrase. What makes this part feel so lively? Let's sing this part once. Sing it with me. This is the first note. Ready? And la 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 la. Let's sing it again. Ready? And la 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 la. Mozart starts his piece with 2 long notes, but then immediately he moves to 8 short notes, which give us the feeling of a movement, maybe like a child running outside. How do we write it with musical notes? Do you realize you already have the ability to write it down? Let's do it together. Let's say that this is the beat. We need to take the tempo a little slower for our exercise. We will only say the rhythm. We will have 2 ta in the beginning, then 8 ti, and again 2 ta at the end. Let's say it together. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, ta. Let's say it again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, ta. Here we can see on the screen everything we need to create the rhythm we just said. Half notes, quarter rests, and 8 notes. Our first 2 notes are the longest ones. Ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, ta. So, which notes would you use? Which notes are the longest ones? That's right. Mozart's phrase starts with 2 half notes. What next? Listen again. Ta, ta, ti, 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 ti. So, which notes would follow those half notes? Exactly, the shortest ones, the 8 notes. And we already know we have 8 of those. What next? Listen again to the beginning. Ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, ta. So, which notes didn't we use yet? We still have 2 quarter notes and 2 quarter rests. So, which notes are we going to use now? There is no rest yet, so we will choose the quarter notes. And we will add 2 quarter rests at the end. And here is the first part of the phrase. Let's say the rhythm again and see if we did it right. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4. ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, ta. Yes, that's exactly the rhythm. Now let's listen to the beginning played by the orchestra and see if we can follow the rhythm we just wrote. It worked! You just wrote your first musical phrase. Well, it's not really your phrase, it's Mozart phrase, but you just figured it out. I'm really proud of you. Later this week, you can listen to the whole movement and you can discover the other movements too. So now you know more about Mozart as a child, but I would like us to learn more about the classical period. Why is this period called the classical period? What elements make the music in this period sound the way it does? How is this music different from the one composed during the Baroque period? I invited today a special guest to talk to us about all that. You already met him when we learned about the Baroque period. Do you remember our friend Ted Wiprud? Let's say hello to him. Hi Ted, I was just telling the students about Mozart's life, but I was wondering if you could tell us more about the music in the classical period.
Hi Miss Ella, hello everyone. I'm so glad to be back with you to explore the music of the classical period, when Mozart was alive and composing. Let's find out what made that music sound the way it does. The classical period of classical music. Wait, is that a little confusing? Well, classical music means everything throughout history composed in this classical tradition that comes from Europe. The classical period is just one small part of that long tradition. A small part, but a very important one, because in the classical period, composers came up with forms of music that became standard ways of thinking for hundreds of years. They composed many of the classics of classical music. Maybe that's why it's called the classical period. So how can we recognize music of the classical period? What makes it different from Baroque music? Well, you may remember that Baroque music has a lot going on. If you hear a melody in one voice, you're likely to hear it in another voice that imitates that first voice. Two independent voices. Then third voice. Now a fourth voice. It's beautiful, but kind of complicated. And then you remember learning about ornamentation, like this. That's the sound of Baroque music. Now in the classical period, composers streamlined their music. As Miss Ella told you, they wanted music that was clear and clean and without all that fussy detail. So here's some of this music of Mozart that you already heard. Do you hear the difference? It's got this simple melody that anyone can sing. It's in the top voice, so it's easy to hear. And all the other notes just support that. No imitation, no ornamentation, just simple beauty. Mozart's music sounds that way because he composed during a time when writers and artists really valued clear thinking and direct expression, without all those fussy details. And you can see that in the buildings of the time as well. They're full of light and built out of simple shapes, without so much flowery Baroque ornamentation. Another important change in the classical period was the idea of contrast, different sounds right next to each other. In Baroque music, one movement or piece will have the same mood from beginning to end, but classical period composers like to change things up. Miss Ella has already shown you this in Mozart's very first symphony. I'm going to play the same notes you heard the orchestra play. Remember? energetic first idea, and then right away, a peaceful idea. Now that's in Mozart's very first symphony, composed when he was just 9 years old. But you hear exactly the same thing in his very last symphony, composed when he was all of 32. Energy at the beginning, and then a peaceful answer. Energy, peaceful. Those two ideas, energy and peace, create a tension that makes music of the classical period go. It's kind of like if you and your friend are having a pretend argument. You just keep saying opposite things, but it's just a game, you're having fun. It's the same with this music. No matter how much contrast you hear, you can be sure that classical period music will always come to a peaceful resolution. I hope it's the same with your friend. And buildings of this time also have contrasting shapes that live together in harmony. Here's a sketch of what we call a simple tempo form. On the top you see a triangle. Then below it, between the columns, are rectangles standing up. And across the bottom, the stairs create a rectangle lying down. Triangle, rectangle, all living in harmony. Sometimes a round dome is added on top. Yet more contrast, but still supporting each other in harmony. Another thing Mozart loved was balance. What I mean is one bit of music being balanced by another bit of music, like two sides of a building, or the two sides of a seesaw. If you go up, I go down. Going up, going down. Up and down, balanced on the seesaw. We hear this very clearly in this music of Mozart we've been listening to. You'll hear a 4-beat phrase going down, followed by a 4-beat phrase going up. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then going back up. 2, 3, 4. 4 balances 4. Down balances up. If we go on in the music, you'll hear that same 4-beat phrase going down. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then 4 beats coming back to rest. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 balances 4. And this 4 plus 4 balances the first 4 plus 4. So it's 8 balances 8. If we go on in the music, you'll find another 4 plus 4 balancing another 4 plus 4. So it's actually 16 balances 16, making 32. It's kind of like math, isn't it? Now that's not surprising, because in Mozart's time, people were really interested in science and math. They wanted to be able to explain the world through what they could see and what they could figure out. And just as we hear balance in this music, we see it in the buildings of that time. Do you see how the two sides of the building are balanced across the dome in the middle? Many of the important buildings of the United States government are designed in this style because simple shapes, contrasts, balance, harmony, these things represent reason and order and fairness. The same things we hear in Mozart's music. I really hope you enjoy the music of Mozart and the classical period. There's so much to explore and to play. I'll see you again when you get to the next period of music. Until then, keep listening and keep playing.
Thank you so much, Ted. This was really interesting. Ted talked to us about some important elements in the music composed during the classical period: clarity, contrast, and balance. To end this lesson, I would like to take a look at one of Mozart's chamber pieces and try to find some of those elements in his music. This piece is for 5 instruments, or as we call it in music, a quintet. Mozart wrote his quintet for an unusual combination of instruments: a piano and 4 wind instruments: oboe, clarinet, bassoon, and French horn. Three of these wind instruments, the oboe, the clarinet, and the bassoon, are part of the woodwind family. We will have a lesson about this family next week. We already talked about the idea of contrast when we worked on Mozart's first symphony, right? We saw how the energetic part and the peaceful part of the phrase complete each other. Now I would like us to listen to an example of balance in Mozart's Quintet. In the example we will hear, the phrase will be equally divided between the wind instruments. A beautiful and simple phrase. The clarinet will start, then the oboe will continue the phrase, followed by the bassoon and the French horn. Each instrument will have an equal number of beats to play. Once all the instruments get to play their part of the phrase, they will all play together, keeping the balance as a unified group. If you listen carefully, I'm sure you will feel this balance. You can also pay attention to another important element we talked about today, the clarity and simplicity of the melody. By the way, I think you might recognize the clarinet player. Let's listen to the quintet playing. This music is just beautiful, don't you think? Mozart thought so too. He composed this piece when he was 28 years old, and when he finished composing it, he wrote to his father, "I myself consider it to be the best thing I have written in my life." It is definitely one of his best known pieces. This quintet has 3 movements, and we just listened to an example from the second movement. This week, you can listen to the different movements and try to find the elements we have talked about today: the clarity, the contrast, and the balance. Mozart composed more than 600 pieces in his short life. He composed many concertos for different instruments, about 100 chamber music pieces, many pieces for piano, music for the church, and operas, like a play in which the characters sing their lines and they are accompanied by an orchestra. We will have a lesson about opera later this year. It will be impossible to present to you all these different kinds of music Mozart composed in the short time we have together, but I encourage you to go online this week and try to listen to some of his pieces. You will see that his music has this magical combination of lightness, joy, elegance, and rhythmic motion. I hope you enjoyed our lesson today. I will see you next week when we will learn about the woodwind family. Until then, make it a musical week.